Welcome, Gunrunner.
Released in 1995, the Sega Nomad was developed as a replacement for the Game Gear and followed suit by being based on existing home console technology. But the Nomad went one better, as rather than being simply based around the same hardware as the Game Gear was with the Master System, this new portable was fully compatible with the 16-bit Sega Genesis. Almost as soon as it was announced, the Sega Nomad seemed like a winner. As a fully portable Sega Genesis, it already had a huge library of games, a great screen, and a really cool 6-button design. But the poor battery life and very high $180 launch price, in comparison a regular Sega Genesis console could be bought for around half the price at this time, meant that its success was very limited, and the Nomad did nothing to stop the Nintendo handheld juggernaut. This was also around the time that Sega went into freefall, making a number of catastrophic mistakes, including the development of the 32X and the botched design and launch of the Saturn. So I guess we shouldn't be too surprised that they dropped the ball with this handheld too. Despite being so closely related to one of the most popular consoles of all time, the Nomad remains pretty obscure, and you don't see it covered all that often, and I'm guessing that's why it won by a landslide when I ran my latest Amazing Facts poll. So you voted in large numbers, I listened, and now here we are, as I proudly present 10 amazing Sega Nomad facts.
This is the best way not to get your license on the first try.
And this is the best way to get video games.
Noggin!
Sega Channel, over 70 hot games a month for your Genesis machine. No lines, no limits, no late fees, just unlimited play on your TV. Sega Channel, less than $15 a month. Call your cable company now. Sega Channel, the only way to get it is to get it.
The next part of the Nomad origin story concerns another handheld that came before it, and I don't mean the Game Gear, because this entry is about the much more obscure Sega Megajet. Only ever released in Japan, this all-in-one unit was originally designed for Japan Air in 1993 for customers to rent from them in flight. The console has no screen, but everything else is built into what looks like a giant controller. This is because all Japan airplanes had small LCD TVs built into the back of each seat. So you just had to plug your Megajet into this, rent a game to go with it, and play away. Seeing this idea and thinking it was cool, well-known car audio accessories manufacturer Alpine also commissioned their own version of the Megajet 2, to be used with similar in-car TVs. So with this in mind, it seems incredibly bizarre that Sega decided to market the system at retail too, albeit in Japan only. I can only guess that they saw a gap in the market to exploit, even if it was an incredibly niche one, and thought let's go with it. Unsurprisingly, the retail Megajet was less than successful and disappeared from the market within a year of its 1994 release. But the Megajet did leave a very interesting legacy. Impressed by the miniaturised design, Sega of America decided to develop it further to add a screen and turn it into, yes, you guessed it, the Sega Nomad, the subject of this very video. In the next part, I'll elaborate on that a bit more. As I previously mentioned, Sega of America took a long hard look at the Megajet and felt that it could be adapted into a genuine successor to the Game Gear and become a true portable Genesis. They were impressed by the small size of the device and knew that all they would have to do is add an LCD screen to the device and rejig the design slightly to make it work. This would be a huge cost save versus developing a new handheld from scratch like originally intended, and I'll come on to that particular tidbit of trivia in the next chapter. Keeping the convention of using the name of a planet as the console's codename, the Saturn was actually the first and only Sega system to keep its original moniker for retail. The new handheld was dubbed the Venus. As you can see from this early prototype of the portable, it was originally white and grey in colour, a bit like the Saturn actually, with a Game Gear-like design that included the same joypad alongside the 6 buttons of the revised Mega Drive controller. But the designers within Sega felt that this didn't look anywhere near cool enough, Remember, Sega very much had the image of the so-called cool kids due to Sonic the Hedgehog and their lack of censorship compared to big rivals Nintendo. So they went back to the drawing board and came up with something that had much more authentic design cues when compared to both the Mega Drive and Genesis consoles. It's not a well-known fact, but Sega's previous handheld, the Game Gear, was only ever meant to be a stopgap. It was a panic measure after seeing Nintendo's Game Boy and then Atari's Lynx, which Epyx actually offered to Sega first, but were turned down because the arrogant bosses at Sega of Japan wouldn't accept a system designed externally by an American company and felt that they could do better. After trying to make something much closer to the Lynx first, and failing due to almost endless technical difficulties, they quickly redesigned the existing 8-bit Master System into a handheld with a few extra features such as a larger colour palette and stereo sound. But almost as soon as the Game Gear made it out the door, they went back to the drawing board to work on the true successor. By this point, Sega had realised that they needed to come up with something completely different if they were to capture the handheld market. Something with innovative features that nobody had seen before, and their idea was to create a touchscreen portable. This idea was inspired by early PDA devices, and Sega of Japan felt that it wouldn't be too hard to adapt this technology to play games. However, they soon discovered that this wasn't going to work for a number of different reasons, including the reliability of the touchscreens themselves at this time, speed issues when trying to use them for games, and the lack of inexpensive colour touchscreens. This saw the idea cancelled before it really got anywhere, with Sega then going down the Mega Drive route instead. Remember, this was 2 years before Tiger Electronics managed to do the very same with their monochrome Tiger.com handheld, and we all saw how that turned out. As I already mentioned in passing, the Sega Nomad was specifically designed for the American market, a first for Sega, who had previously debuted all of their systems in their homeland of Japan. However, it was always intended that the Nomad would make it into other markets in due course. Sega just felt that the huge popularity of the Sega Genesis in North America, combined with strong sales of handheld consoles in general in the region, meant that it was the ideal place for the Nomad to debut, and hoped it would be just as successful as what came before. But let's expand on that decision a bit more, because it probably seems strange to many that a Japanese company would pass up their own homeland. So it's worth pointing out that the Mega Drive wasn't particularly successful in the land of the rising sun, being dominated by both the PC Engine and Super Famicom. By October 1995, when the Nomad was released in North America, Sega had stopped releasing new Mega Drive games in Japan altogether, just supporting the console in Western markets where it had been much more successful. It was hinted that the Nomad would hit Europe next, which would have made perfect sense given Sega dominated in this region. It was reported that the Mega Drive outsold the Super Nintendo by 2-1 in Western Europe, where Virgin Mastertronic had led the distribution of all Sega products since the launch of the Master System. However, the poor sales of the Nomad in North America, along with the portable's high price — remember, European consumers were a lot more cost savvy than their American counterparts — caused them to backtrack on this decision. I should also note that the Nomad has region lockout included in its BIOS, so it will only play games designed to work on American consoles, although it is possible to modify this if you want to get access to the many Japanese and European only releases. Going back to the launch of the Sega Nomad for a moment, it's interesting to note that the handheld was not just exclusive to North America, but also exclusive to one particular store, Toys R Us, who struck a very lucrative deal with Sega to make this happen. You'll see Toys R Us catalogues of the time heavily promote this coup, and the famous retailer hoped that this announcement would help bring more people to their stores. However, slow sales of the Sega Nomad saw this deal cancelled within 6 months of the portable's launch, and it soon became available in other retailers too. The end of this exclusivity deal also saw a big price drop, and this was the first of many as Sega began selling the console at a huge loss just to shift all their inventory. It's been reported that 1 million Sega Nomads were produced by Sega, and they did sell them all through retail, although it took them until the end of the decade to do so, with the handheld not being officially discontinued until 1999, just before the release of the Dreamcast. It didn't help that Sega didn't do a lot of marketing for the Nomad, because their operations were already stretched due to having the Game Gear, Genesis, Sega CD, 32X and Saturn on the market at the same time. Splitting their advertising budget between 6 different systems was already pretty difficult. But Sega of America were also under strict instructions from Sega Japan to keep the Saturn as their primary focus, leaving the Nomad largely ignored. One of the key selling points of the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis was its wide range of accessories and add-ons, including things like the power-based converter that allowed you to play Master System games, the X-Band modem, the Mega CD, and the Sega Multitap. Now, with the Nomad being a portable with its own built-in screen, it was always obvious that it wouldn't be compatible with most of these, especially stuff like the Mega CD and power-based converter. Unbelievably though, it is actually possible to use the 32X add-on with the Sega Nomad handheld, albeit after a fair bit of modding and soldering, but it is actually possible. There are various guides telling you how to do this online and numerous YouTube videos that show it working too, and I have to say that it's an amazingly impressive feat, even if it does look absolutely ridiculous. But the Nomad was never advertised as working with the 32X of course, and the range of compatible accessories is actually fairly small, but probably larger than you'd think, as it is actually compatible with the Sega Activator, TeamTap adapter, Mega Mouse, and both the Sega Channel and X-Band modems. It also got a few of its own accessories too, but I'll get to those shortly. One of the biggest issues with the Nomad, one of the key contributing factors in its lack of success, was the terrible battery life. A full 16-bit colour console was never going to be very power efficient, especially one with a Motorola 68000 CPU, which was known as being very energy intensive. Anecdotally, the designers of the Atari Lynx said that they initially considered using the same CPU, but swapped it out for the custom 6502 precisely for this reason. But nobody could believe just how bad the battery life was. It was reported at the time that a set of rechargeables would only get you just 2 hours of play, with good quality alkaline batteries stretching this to 3. That was less than the Game Gear that came before it, and far less than the 20 odd hours of the market leading Nintendo Game Boy. And remember, this was based on 6 AA batteries, which added a lot of weight to the handheld too, and Sega realised quite quickly that they had a problem. The Nomad was often bundled with an AC adapter for this exact reason, and 2 further solutions were offered by Sega to help keep the Nomad portable. The first of these was a car charger, which was basically identical to the one designed for the Game Gear before it, and this could be plugged into the cigarette lighter socket in your car to avoid using batteries on long journeys. The second solution was the Nomad Power Back, a big heavy block that was attached to the back of the unit and then connected to the power socket. This could be recharged after use and promised up to 6 hours of play, although this would deteriorate over time. Although it was a good idea, this made the Nomad even more bulky than it was already and ridiculously heavy to boot, making it somewhat unpractical to many. One of the most interesting aspects of the Nomad was that it didn't actually come with a pack-in game, the first Sega system to be sold standalone. It's usually stated that this decision was made to keep the cost down, a trick Atari had previously pulled at the Lynx to keep its cost closer to the Game Boy and Game Gear. But the real reason is a lot more interesting than this, and tells you a lot about the mess Sega was in around this time. It was originally intended that a rather innovative new game called the Ooze would be the pack-in for the Nomad, and indeed this was the first and only Mega Drive game to be developed with the handheld in mind, being play tested on the unit to make sure that it didn't suffer on the small screen like many other Mega Drive games did. Created by the Sega Technical Institute, in fact it was the very last Mega Drive game developed by the studio, this action-oriented strategy game saw you controlling a puddle of green ooze that used an advanced fluid-like algorithm developed specifically for the game. You must explore the maze-like levels to find special DNA, as well as increase your ooze by assimilating enemies and flicking switches to unlock new areas, before eventually finding the exit. Big things were expected for the Ooze, and that's why Sega decided to bundle it with the Nomad, Unfortunately, the game fell behind schedule, and Sega of America weren't made aware of this, meaning they quickly had to change their plans with no other suitable new games available. This left a lot of red faces within Sega and only added to the animosity between the Japanese and American divisions. Now considered a cult classic despite the mixed reviews of the time, the Ooze is certainly a good game. I definitely don't think it's a system seller, and you can't help but think that they should have come up with something Sonic related instead if they really wanted to sell the Nomad. One of the most interesting features of the Sega Nomad that really sets it apart from other handhelds of the era is its ability to connect to a regular TV thanks to an AV port on the top right of the handheld. In fact, the Nomad is the very first portable console to have such a feature and means that you get the best of both worlds, a handheld to use on the go and a console you can connect to your TV. This can be done in one of two ways, a Genesis 2 RF cable or a Genesis 2 RCA cable, the latter of which gives a much better picture than the former of course. So there are no special leads needed, just a regular cable that was already widely available. But this isn't the only thing I want to pick up on in this segment, because there is another very useful port that is directly related, and that is the controller port, which is found on the bottom of the unit. This replaces the usual link cable that was used by other handhelds of the time to play games in multiplayer mode. But with this one there is no need to find another Nomad owner to hook up with. You can simply plug in a regular Sega Genesis controller and away you go. Now obviously the screen on the Nomad is far too small to play two-player games properly, so that's where the AV port comes in, because then you can both play on the big screen with one player using the Nomad itself as a controller and the other using the regular joypad. The only small issue with this is that player 1 can actually sabotage player 2 by pulling out their controller, and player 2 also has to be careful not to pull on his joypad too hard because he might take the Nomad with it. But it's still a very cool feature to have. After the failure of the Nomad, Sega decided to exit the handheld space completely and entered an agreement with fellow Japanese arcade company SNK to support their Neo Geo Color Portable, not just with an exclusive Sonic game, which I covered on this channel a few weeks ago, but also a special link-up ability with their new Dreamcast console that provided extra features on both ends. They would eventually end up supporting the handhelds of their great rival Nintendo of course, after they exited the hardware market completely. But in 2007 they made a return of sorts, teaming up with AtGames to release the Sega Arcade Portable. Now I was going to describe this as a successor to the Nomad, but in many ways it's nothing more than a redesign, because this was also a Mega Drive based portable. But this one didn't have a cartridge slot, and instead you had 20 built-in games to choose from, including classics like Sonic & Knuckles, Golden Axe, Shinobi 3, Echo the Dolphin and Columns. But in 2012 it was replaced with the Ultimate Arcade Portable, which made a number of improvements, including 6 buttons instead of 3, double the amount of games, adding stuff like Streets of Rage, Vector Man and Street Fighter 2, and best of all an SD card slot so you could add your own games too. Both these handhelds were marketed by Blaze in Europe and Tectoy in Brazil, and the latter version of this handheld went through several different revisions that featured slightly different game lineups. Although these had some good features like the aforementioned SD card slot, as well as TV out, a rechargeable battery and indeed a much longer battery life to go with it, the big problem was the hardware itself, because these used the Genesis on a chip design that had already been used in numerous clone consoles, and it suffered from screen tear and worst of all, horrendously bad sound emulation that was especially noticeable on the original Sonic the Hedgehog, where all the music was totally out of tune. It's still possible to pick these handhelds up, but you're much better off getting a dedicated handheld emulation device like the Anbernic and adding your own emulators and ROMs, as they're a lot more authentic and have a lot more features too.
The McVickers came to me. They wanted advice. Investments, savings. That's what I do. And I go strictly by the book. The video game and electronic toy book by Toys R Us. There's over $500 in coupons. You can save $7 in select Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo games like Shaq Fu, and a wealth of games like Sonic 1 and Star Fox for just $19.97. The McVickers even got a new car. Get this savings book now at Toys R Us. Or in the Sunday's paper.
And there runs on my look at 10 amazing Sega Nomad facts. But which one of these fabulous facts was your favourite, or can you think of any other tantalising tidbits of trivia that I didn't include? We always love to hear the thoughts and views of my audience, so please get typing in that comments section. Before I go though, I must thank all of my loyal patrons and YouTube backers for continuing to support my channel and make videos like this possible. However, I must give special thanks to the following people in particular for their much appreciated pledges: Paul Daniel, Mins, Dos Gamerman, Luke MC, Carl Olsen, Seth Robinson, Frosty, Mark Strickland, Kalimatorn, Trolldor the Burninator, Daniel Skoronsky, Ben P. Stein, Tabby Kitsune, David Maddox, Your Eyes Are Bleeding, Joe Casara, Classic Gamer 74, Bernard Santu, Peter Grantham, Noah Mann, Josh Hartman, and Electron Star Collapse. If you also want to help support all my creative endeavours, including this YouTube channel, then please go and check out my Patreon right now, where you can get access to host extra content including downloads, exclusive videos, creative insights, and much more besides. I've been the Laird, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you all again for another video very soon.